It's 11 p.m. Your phone buzzes. One message. I still have our conversation. Do what I ask or everyone finds out. Your stomach drops before your mind even catches up. Maybe it's someone you used to love, holding on to screenshots like ammunition. Maybe it's someone you trusted with something private, now turning that trust into leverage. In that instant, every cell in your body screams to fix this immediately. Apologize, negotiate, beg, pay, anything to make the threat disappear before anyone sees it. But here is what almost nobody tells you in that moment. The person who comes out on top of this situation is never the one who reacts fastest. It's the one who goes quiet, thinks clearly, and moves only once they understand the real shape of the threat sitting in front of them. There's a name for that state of mind. We're going to call it silent sovereignty. The discipline of ruling your own reaction before you ever try to rule the situation itself. Tonight, we walk through exactly how that discipline works, one principle at a time, drawn from the mind of a man who understood power and fear better than almost anyone in history, Niccolo Machiavelli. Before we go further, one small thing. If you've ever felt your stomach drop reading a message like that, just type the word steady in the comments right now. Not because we need the number, because naming what you're feeling, even in one word, is the first step toward not being ruled by it. Now let's open the first principle, the one almost everyone gets wrong in the first 5 minutes after the threat lands. The first thing silent sovereignty asks of you has nothing to do with the blackmailer. It has to do with your own face, your own fingers, your own first 90 seconds. Picture someone who receives that threatening text at 11 p.m. Within 4 minutes, they've typed out a reply, an apology, an explanation, maybe a promise. They've told 2 friends already, voice shaking, spilling every detail of the threat before they've even decided what they want to do about it. By midnight, they've said more, revealed more, and shown more fear than the blackmailer could have hoped to extract with any amount of actual leverage. Now picture a second version of the same night. Someone else receives the identical message. They put the phone face down. They don't answer. They don't tell anyone yet. They sit with the discomfort for 1 hour, then 2, before writing a single word. The content of the threat in both cases might be exactly the same, but the outcome from this point forward will not be. Here is the mechanism underneath this. Extortion is not primarily a transaction of information. It's a transaction of fear. The blackmailer doesn't actually know in that first message how damaging the material really is to you, how much you truly stand to lose, or how likely you are to comply. What they know is only what you show them. Every panicked reply, every visible tremor in your words, every rushed offer to negotiate is data, and that data sets the price. This is rooted in something older than smartphones and screenshots. Humans have always read distress signals to calculate how much power they hold over another person. A predator does not need to see the wound to know where to strike. It only needs to see you flinch. The flinch is the information. Long before extortion existed in text messages, it existed in courts, in marketplaces, in negotiations between rulers who never showed their true hand until they understood exactly who they were dealing with. And the losing side, almost always, was whichever party let their fear leak out first and let the other side read it like an open book. Machiavelli understood this dynamic with unsettling clarity. In The Prince, he wrote that everyone sees what you appear to be, but few ever touch what you really are. Read that again in this context. The blackmailer cannot see your actual finances, your actual relationships, your actual capacity to withstand exposure. All they can see is what you choose to display. If what you display is composure, the entire calculation on their side of the table changes, because their leverage was never built on the messages themselves. It was built on your visible fear of them. So here is what silent sovereignty actually requires of you in these first hours in concrete terms. First, do not reply within the first hour, and ideally not within the first day, no matter how urgent the message claims to be. Urgency is manufactured pressure, not a real deadline, and almost every threat like this survives a delay far better than the sender wants you to believe. Second, choose deliberately who you tell, rather than spilling the situation to whoever happens to be nearby when the panic hits. A calm, trusted person chosen on purpose will help you think, while a room full of people you told in a state of shock will only amplify the fear you're trying to control. Third, while you wait, write down the exact wording of the threat somewhere private. Not to send it anywhere yet, simply to look at it in daylight, stripped of the adrenaline that made it feel bigger at 11 p.m. than it may actually be. And fourth, notice your own body during this waiting period. The tight chest, the racing thoughts, the urge to check your phone every 90 seconds, and treat those sensations as exactly what they are, a temporary physiological state, not new information about how dangerous the situation has actually become. Fear feels like evidence. It rarely is, but composure by itself is not a plan. It's only the floor you stand on while you build one. Once the initial panic has been contained, the far more important question becomes how much of this threat is even real, how much power the other person actually holds. And that is exactly where most people, even composed ones, get the next move completely wrong. Composure buys you time, but time is only useful if you spend it understanding what you're actually facing, not what your fear imagines you're facing. Consider two people who each waited that first crucial hour before responding. The first spends the hour assuming the absolute worst, assuming the messages are already screenshotted to a dozen people, assuming exposure is imminent and total, assuming there is no way out but total surrender to whatever is being asked. The second spends that same hour doing something almost nobody thinks to do in a crisis, asking cold, specific questions about the actual mechanics of the threat. What precisely do they claim to have? Have they shown proof or only described it? Is the everyone in everyone will find out a real, named group of people, or a vague, frightening abstraction designed to feel infinite? Is there anything to suggest they've already taken the irreversible step of sending it anywhere, or is the threat itself the entire extent of their actions so far? The mechanism here is one of the oldest tricks in the psychology of coercion. Most people never distinguish between a threat and an action. A threat is a bet the other person is placing on your fear responding as if the worst has already happened. The moment you respond as though the exposure is already underway, you've paid the price of the outcome, without the outcome ever needing to occur. This is precisely why so many blackmail attempts, examined afterward, turn out to have been bluffs with no real intention or capability behind them. The sender was gambling entirely on the victim's imagination doing the damage for them. It costs a blackmailer nothing to type the words, "Everyone will see this." It costs them considerably more in risk and effort to actually follow through, and many never intended to. The gap between the sentence and the action is exactly where your clear thinking is supposed to live. Machiavelli built an entire philosophy of statecraft on refusing to make this mistake. He wrote that one must be a fox to recognize traps and a lion to frighten wolves, because the fox and the lion are not the same animal, and confusing them gets you killed, either as prey or as a fool walking blindly into a snare. Applied here, you cannot fight what you haven't correctly identified. Treating a bluff as if it were a certainty makes you weaker than the situation requires. Treating a genuine, evidenced threat as if it were a bluff makes you reckless. The fox's job in this moment is simply to see clearly which one you're actually dealing with. In practice, this means doing a cold audit before your next move. Ask what evidence has actually been shown to you, a real screenshot, a real file, versus what has only been described in words, because words cost nothing to fabricate, and images can sometimes be faked or exaggerated. 2. Ask what this person's history with you actually suggests about their willingness to follow through. Someone who has burned bridges with everyone they've ever threatened behaves differently than someone acting completely out of character in a moment of anger. And ask yourself honestly what the actual cost would be if the worst-case scenario happened, rather than the imagined, catastrophized version of that cost. Because very often, when people force themselves to answer this question plainly, the real damage is survivable in a way their panic refused to admit. It can also help to ask what the other person actually gains from following through versus what they gain simply from you believing they might. If the answer is very little beyond your fear, that alone tells you most of what you need to know about how real the threat actually is. Knowing what you're facing changes everything about your next move. But knowing is not the same as acting wisely. And this is the exact point where fear pushes people toward the single most damaging response of all, giving the other person exactly what they came for. There is a particular kind of message that blackmail targets send back once the fear peaks. And it sounds something like this. Please, I'm begging you, don't do this. I'll do anything. Just tell me what you want. It feels, in the moment, like the only reasonable thing left to do. An appeal to the other person's decency, their memory of whatever relationship once existed between you. Consider one version of this. Someone pleads at length, offers money immediately, apologizes repeatedly for whatever the private messages contained, and asks what else they can do to make this go away. The blackmailer's response, more often than people expect, is not relief or mercy. It's a new demand. Consider a second, quieter version. Someone acknowledges receipt of the message with a single, flat line, offers nothing emotional, asks no forgiveness, and states only that they are considering their options. The second person, counterintuitively, tends to face fewer follow-up demands than the first. Here is why begging fails as a strategy, and it isn't about morality, it's about incentive structure. Pleading confirms, in the clearest possible language, that the threat works. It tells the other person exactly how much fear they have successfully created. And fear that has already proven effective once is a resource people rarely abandon voluntarily. They return to draw from it again. Begging also signals desperation, and desperation reads as a lack of other options, which, to someone extracting leverage, means there is no ceiling yet reached on what can be demanded. Machiavelli's harshest and most famous line addresses exactly this dynamic, though people usually only quote half of it. He wrote that it is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. But the fuller argument matters more here. Love, he said, is held together by a bond of obligation that people break the instant it becomes inconvenient for them, while a more disciplined form of respect holds because it doesn't depend on the other person's goodwill at all. Translated out of statecraft and into this situation, appealing to someone's decency assumes they have decency left to appeal to, and if they've already crossed the line into extorting you, that assumption is usually the exact miscalculation that costs people the most. None of this means becoming cold or cruel in return. It means refusing to hand over the one thing begging always gives away for free, which is confirmation that you're afraid. In practice, if any response is warranted at all, it should be brief, unemotional, and give away nothing about your internal state. No pleading, no detailed justification of the private messages in question. No promises made under panic that you may not be able to keep or may regret later. It should also avoid the opposite trap of aggression or threats back, since escalation often provokes exactly the retaliation you're trying to prevent. And critically, it should never include an offer of payment as a first move, because the moment money changes hands once, it establishes a functioning transaction rather than ending a threat. And functioning transactions tend to repeat. One more detail matters here. Silence itself, held with intention rather than panic, is often the strongest reply available. It tells the other person nothing about how deeply the message landed, and it denies them the immediate emotional payoff that so many people extorting others are actually quietly hunting for. Refusing to beg protects your position. But a position isn't a fortress by itself. It needs something solid underneath it, something Machiavelli considered the very foundation of surviving any crisis. And almost nobody does it until it's already too late. Machiavelli spent a significant portion of his writing warning rulers against a single specific failure, waiting until the crisis arrives to begin preparing for it. He believed that the people who survive dangerous moments are, almost without exception, the people who quietly built their defenses long before danger was visible on the horizon, not out of paranoia, but out of discipline. Consider someone who, the moment a threat like this lands, realizes they have nothing. No saved copies of the original conversation for context, no record of exactly when the threat was received, no notes on what was said and by whom. Their entire account of events exists only in memory, which fear reliably distorts within hours. Now consider someone else who, from the very first message, begins quietly building a record. Screenshots of the thread itself, timestamps, a simple written account of what happened and when, saved somewhere the other person cannot access or delete. The mechanism here is straightforward, but frequently ignored under stress. Memory degrades under fear, and informal, undocumented situations always favor whoever is willing to lie more confidently about what happened. If this situation escalates to friends, to family, to an employer, to law enforcement, to a lawyer, the person with a calm, dated, factual record will always be believed more easily and will always have more options available than the person relying on a shaken, second-hand recollection of events. This isn't about assuming the worst will happen. It's about refusing to be unprepared if it does. Machiavelli is frequently credited with the observation that whoever is not prepared today will be even less prepared tomorrow. And whether or not every word of that phrasing is his exact original ink, it captures precisely the discipline he preached throughout his work. Virtù, in his vocabulary, was not raw talent or luck. It was the capacity to act with skill and foresight, specifically because the necessary preparation had already been done before it was needed. In concrete terms, this means taking screenshots of every message from the person threatening you the moment they arrive, including timestamps, and storing them somewhere outside of the app itself. Emailed to yourself, saved to a cloud folder, backed up in more than one place. It means writing a simple, factual timeline as events unfold. What was said, when, by whom, without embellishment or emotional framing, because a calm record serves you better later than an emotional one. And it means resisting the urge to delete the original private messages in a panic, even though that instinct feels protective, because deleting your own record of the full context can strip you of the very evidence that later proves the situation and your position within it more accurately than the blackmailer's version alone. If there is any usernames, phone numbers, or account handles attached to the threat, record those too, since they are often what eventually allows a platform or an investigator to trace who actually sent it, even when the sender assumes they are anonymous. Preparation gives you a foundation to stand on, but a foundation is only useful once you decide what you're actually going to build on top of it. And the next move is where composure and evidence come together into your first real strategic choice. Once you have a clear head and a clear record, the real strategic question becomes what to do with the leverage the other person believes they hold. And here, Machiavelli's thinking on appearances becomes unexpectedly practical rather than purely theoretical. He observed that people judge far more by the eye than by the hand. That is, they judge by what is visible and public rather than by what is actually true underneath. Consider a person whose private messages are used as a threat, who spends every waking hour terrified of the moment those messages become public, treating that potential exposure as an absolute, unsurvivable catastrophe. Now consider someone in an identical situation who spends that same time quietly asking a different question. If the worst genuinely happened, what would the actual, real-world fallout be? And is there a way to get ahead of that narrative rather than simply waiting to be buried by it? This is what we might call the exposure illusion, and it works almost entirely on the assumption that your silence and fear are permanent. Most blackmail leverage depends on the target never controlling the story themselves, because once you take partial ownership of the narrative, on your own terms, in your own words, to the people who actually matter to you, the blackmailer's version loses most of its detonating power. It's the difference between a story breaking about you versus a story you've already, calmly, partially told about yourself. Think about how differently the same piece of news lands depending on who tells it first. A headline written by someone trying to damage you reads nothing like the same facts explained briefly and honestly by the person they actually happen to. Machiavelli's point about eyes and hands captures why this works. The public rarely investigates the full truth of anything. They respond to whatever is presented first and most confidently. If the first version of events that reaches the people who matter is a shaken, defensive, secretive one, it invites suspicion. If the first version is a composed, forthright account delivered on your terms before it can be forced out of you, it invites something closer to sympathy or simple indifference. This is not a blanket instruction to publicly announce private matters. It's a calculated judgment call specific to your situation, made with a trusted advisor or professional rather than alone at 1 a.m. In practice, it means identifying in advance the small number of people whose opinion of you would actually matter if the worst happened, and considering whether a calm, private, preemptive conversation with them on your terms before any forced exposure would diffuse more damage than it would create. It means recognizing that shame thrives specifically in secrecy, and that removing the secrecy selectively and deliberately often removes a large percentage of the blackmailer's actual power over you. And it means accepting that you do not need every single person to know nothing ever happened. You only need the narrative, wherever it does surface, to already have your voice in it, rather than only theirs. This single shift, from waiting to be exposed to choosing what gets said and when, is often the exact moment people describe as when they stopped feeling like a victim of the situation and started feeling like someone actively managing it. Controlling the narrative removes a portion of their leverage, but leverage built on a threat of illegal exposure, of stalking, harassment, extortion, exists inside a system with real consequences, and knowing exactly when and how to bring that system in is the next and often most feared step. Many people hesitate to involve police, a lawyer, or a platform's reporting system because it feels like admitting defeat, like losing control of a private matter by handing it to strangers. Picture someone who endures weeks of escalating threats alone, convinced that going to authorities will only make things worse, expose them further, or simply not be taken seriously. Picture someone else, facing an identical threat, who consults a lawyer early, not necessarily to file anything immediately, but simply to understand, factually, what their actual legal standing is and what tools exist if the situation escalates further. Extortion, threats made in exchange for money, sexual content, or compliance, and repeated harassment are not gray areas most legal systems ignore. They are named, prosecutable offenses in the vast majority of jurisdictions, and reporting platforms increasingly have dedicated teams for exactly this kind of digital coercion. The mechanism blocking people from using these tools is rarely lack of access. It's shame and a mistaken belief that using formal power makes a private matter permanently public, when in reality, most of these processes are built with confidentiality in mind. Machiavelli drew a sharp distinction throughout his work between relying on the unpredictable, shifting goodwill of an informal crowd versus relying on solid, established structures of law and order. He wrote that whoever builds his position on the people alone builds on mud, because popular sentiment shifts without warning, while formal institutions, however imperfect, At least operate by fixed rules you can learn, anticipate, and use. In this context, the people is the fear of what the crowd might think if you get authorities involved, and mud is the false safety of handling something this serious entirely alone, hoping it quietly disappears. In practice, this means treating a lawyer's initial consultation, which is often confidential and sometimes free for an initial call, as an information gathering step rather than a dramatic escalation. You are not committing to a lawsuit by asking what your options are. It means learning your specific platform's reporting tools for harassment, extortion, and non-consensual sharing of private content, since most major platforms now remove such material and can trace accounts far faster than most users assume. And it means recognizing that involving formal systems early, before things escalate to actual publication, is generally far more effective than waiting until after the damage is already done, when far fewer remedies remain available to you. It also helps to remember that reporting something does not obligate you to a public process. Most jurisdictions and platforms allow an initial report to remain confidential while it's assessed, so the fear of making it official rarely matches how these systems actually operate in practice. Bringing structure and law into your corner strengthens your position considerably, but even a strong position can crumble if you choose the wrong people to stand beside you while you hold it. And this next principle is one Machiavelli returned to again and again. Once a threat like this becomes known, even to a small circle, you inevitably discover something uncomfortable. Not everyone reacts the way you expected. Picture someone who, believing they need support, tells the first available people around them, coworkers, distant acquaintances, an entire group chat, only to find some of that information quietly spreading further, distorted with each retelling until the story bears little resemblance to what actually happened. Picture someone else who, in the same crisis, deliberately narrows their circle to 2 or 3 people whose discretion and loyalty have already been tested in smaller ways over years and confides only in them. Machiavelli's writing on courts and advisors is essentially a study in exactly this problem. He observed that a ruler is judged, in large part, by the quality of the people he surrounds himself with, because those people either reinforce his judgment or quietly corrode it. He also warned specifically against flatterers, people who tell you only what you want to hear in a crisis, either out of their own discomfort with conflict or a desire to seem supportive, rather than telling you the clear-eyed truth you actually need to hear in order to act well. He believed a wise ruler deliberately sought out advisors willing to speak uncomfortable truths, and just as deliberately closed the door to those who offered only flattery, precisely because flattery feels good in the moment and costs you dearly later, when a bad decision made on bad advice can no longer be undone. In a moment like this, the wrong confidant might tell you to simply pay whatever is demanded, because it's easier to hear that than to sit with you through a harder, more strategic conversation. The right confidant asks you the uncomfortable questions this entire lesson has walked through, even when those questions are hard to hear at 1M. In practice, this means auditing your circle honestly before this crisis, or during it if it's already underway. Who in your life has demonstrated real discretion in the past, keeping something difficult private without needing to be asked twice? Who tends to offer clear, sometimes uncomfortable perspective, rather than only comfort and agreement, since comfort alone rarely produces a good strategic decision under pressure? And who has enough emotional distance from the situation to think clearly, rather than someone so personally entangled in it? An ex's close friend, a mutual connection, that their advice is shaped more by their own stake in the outcome than by what's actually best for you. It's worth noting, too, that the right circle is often smaller than instinct suggests. Telling 3 carefully chosen people is nearly always more protective and produces clearer thinking than telling 15 people out of a need for reassurance. Choosing the right people around you turns a lonely crisis into a manageable one. But even the best-handled crisis eventually ends, and the final, most important question is what you do differently afterward so that this specific vulnerability is never available to exploit again. The instinct, once a threat like this has passed or been resolved, is to simply exhale and move on, treating it as an isolated, unfortunate event rather than a signal about a structural gap that made it possible in the first place. Picture someone who survives this exact situation and, 6 months later, finds themselves in the exact same position with a different person, having changed nothing about how they communicate, what they document, or who they trust with sensitive information. The pattern repeats not because they were unlucky twice, but because nothing about the underlying vulnerability ever actually changed the first time around. Picture someone else who, once the immediate danger passes, deliberately uses the experience to rebuild something sturdier. Different habits around what gets said in writing, different instincts about who earns real trust and how quickly. A working knowledge, now, of exactly which steps to take if anything like this ever surfaces again. This is the difference between surviving a single storm and becoming someone storms simply have less power over the next time. Machiavelli's entire philosophy rested on a rejection of relying on luck, what he called fortuna, in favor of building durable capability, what he called virtù, precisely because fortuna is only half of the equation, and virtù is the half you actually control. He wrote that fortune governs perhaps half of our actions, but leaves the other half, or nearly so, to be governed by us. Meaning the goal was never to eliminate all future risk, which is impossible, but to build enough skill, foresight, and composure that whatever risk does arrive finds you far better prepared to meet it than you were the first time. He compared fortune to a river that floods without warning. Those who are swept away are, more often than not, the ones who never bothered to build any levees while the water was calm. That is the entire arc of everything in this video. Not a single tactic for a single bad night, but a standing posture you carry into every future one. In practical terms, this means treating this experience as data rather than only trauma. What specific habit, in hindsight, created the vulnerability in the first place? And what would need to change to close that gap going forward without sliding into either denial or excessive self-blame? It means recognizing that composure under pressure, like any skill, is trainable. The calmer you learn to become in smaller conflicts, the more naturally that same steadiness will be available to you the next time something larger threatens to overwhelm it. And it means understanding, finally, that the goal was never to become someone incapable of being hurt. That isn't realistic for anyone. But to become someone who, when hurt, still knows exactly how to think clearly, act deliberately, and hold their own ground until the storm passes. We've walked through 9 principles tonight. Staying silent before you react, correctly identifying whether you're facing a lion or a bluff, refusing the trap of begging, preparing your evidence before you need it, controlling your own narrative instead of waiting to be buried by someone else's, knowing when and how to bring in real authority, choosing carefully who stands beside you, and finally, using the entire experience to build a version of yourself that this kind of threat has far less power over the next time it appears. None of these principles require you to become someone harder or colder than you already are. They simply ask you to slow down long enough, in the worst moment, to think like someone who has already decided not to be ruled by fear. If you had to pick just one of these that you needed to hear tonight, which one was it? Tell us in the comments, because chances are someone reading this thread needs exactly that same reminder right now. Silent sovereignty was never about becoming cold or cruel or manipulative toward the people in your life. It was always about refusing to let fear make your decisions for you and choosing instead to think clearly, even when everything in you wants to panic. Whatever message is waiting on your phone right now, or whatever one arrives someday in the future, you now know exactly where to start. If tonight's principles gave you something you needed, subscribe for more of this. And remember, as we always say here, stay composed, stay prepared, Stay sovereign over your own mind, no matter what message lands on your screen at 11 p.m.